it's important to note that while these cities are being created, there is both a positive side to it and a negative side to it. And I would look at the positives in terms of the geographical scope, that with the creation of new cities means you have a wider geographical scope as sub-counties dissolve into divisions, and that also kind of creates a wider tax base for the cities. However, the question of whether the tax base is actually viable is something that we need to look further into, because most of these are rural areas. Then you also look at the aspect of physical planning, that with cities you then have clearly designated areas for business, for residential purposes, and these kind of help organize our society. So that would be a positive, and it would also come with improved infrastructure in terms of cities having to put up regional referral hospitals as well as schools that meet the standards of a city, and that is a positive in a way that it would bring services closer. And we also look at it in the sense that new cities attract new investments, because you have more people have developing an interest or coming in because it's a newly created city. And then lastly, there is the general assumption that with increased an increased number of cities, there is generally an increased urban growth that comes with that, and that would be a good for us. However, on the negative side is that while we are getting into all this bit of creating cities and so on and so forth, do we have the capacity as a country? Do we have other cities able to sustain themselves? So that is where the question of domestic revenue comes in the sense that we've previously seen local governments collecting only about 1 to 3% of their budgets. And when it comes to municipalities, they've only been able to collect 10 to 12% of their budgets. So the rest of their budgets have been constantly funded by central governments. And some of these are what we are now turning into cities. So at the end of the day, you realize that government has to meet costs to make sure that all the issues I talked about, the physical infrastructure, etc., all those administrative costs are met in the process. So that is also calling for increased government spending, especially during a time that we are facing currently, the COVID pandemic, with all the effects that have come with it. So that calls ideally for government to borrow. We must recall that in 2019-20, government has already been struggling with efforts, with issues of funding, the creation of new town councils and sub-counties. So that means if you're now adding on cities, then you're going to have to increasingly borrow, of which we already have a very high outstanding debt amount, which amounts to about 47 billion as of December 31st. We've now not put into consideration that all the debts that we've incurred from January to June. So if borrowing is not an option, then you have to look at the taxpayers. That means the taxpayers have to incur a very high burden because we need to meet these costs. So I think that's the positive and negative bit of it. Currently, we don't have the resources to meet the much needed services, but also we don't have the resources to meet the much needed services, and then it also goes back again to government having to borrow and etc. and etc. But there's also the aspect of local economic development, where citizens are able to invest or to earn a living, to have improved livelihoods. For instance, we know that very many people are carrying out agriculture, but despite the fact that they are doing all this agriculture and etc., there is no value addition in terms of industries that can help add value to the crops produced. So it also leaves us a space that if we had value addition, then government would actually have additional sources of revenue. So for me, I don't think that if we go as it is going to happen, with government just going in as it pleases without a plan on how they're going to finance the creation of new cities, then there is definitely no way the services are going to be coming closer to the people. When it comes to the link between tax and development, we recognize for us that tax, yes, it's a tool for development, and we look at that in 4 aspects. That is revenue, repricing, redistribution, and then representation. Revenue in the sense that tax is a tool through which government is able to collect revenue to provide the much needed services, and repricing in the sense that the government uses tax to either encourage the consumption of certain goods. For instance, it might have, it has previously done it, reduced or removed taxes on sanitary towels to encourage people to access them, but also taxing highly some goods such as cigarettes, alcohol, those that are deemed, yes, socially undesirable, to discourage consumption. But also looking at tax as a redistribution tool, that because of tax we are able to transfer wealth from the rich to the poor, and through that you're enabling, say, if a very rich person pays taxes, then those taxes are used, say, to provide social services from which the poor can also benefit. And lastly, we look at the issue of representation in the sense that citizens have a social contract with the government, that while they pay their taxes, they're able to demand for accountability and know what the money is used for. So looking at tax, so that is for us the link between tax and development. And then now when we look at tax in the sense of linking tax to development and the creation of new cities, we then get into issues around the systems for local revenue at the local government level. And I think one thing that has always stood out for us is the need for government to strengthen those systems for local governments to ably collect revenue to finance their budgets. So with the creation of new cities, we need to see that local governments are able to collect revenue to fully finance their development and not rely on central government. And we also need to see that the revenue that is collected is actually being redistributed fairly, to see that even the poorest are able to benefit from the taxes collected. That goes now back to the issue of service delivery, where it's actually the role of local governments to provide services. So that kind of means that local governments should be able to invest or direct more revenue to social services. And lastly, that citizens at that level should be able to demand for accountability on how the revenue or the taxes that they pay are being used, and local governments should also be able to do the same, provide that accountability.